Welcome to it, sports fans. A different ball game. It is that time of the week again. It's a Monday. My goodness, do these weekends go quickly. Great to be with you. Welcome back to another great week. Listen, I want to start off. We've got an honor once again to have the great Professor Ross Tucker on tonight. A really, really interesting subject matter. Of course, if you go and check it out, host of the Science of Sport podcast, the Real Science of Sport podcast, if you're looking for it online, but it is the Science of Sport podcast. So, look, we're going to have a great week this week. We've got plenty of very, very cool guests. I'm excited to Wednesday, we got a great guest. Tomorrow, we've got Darren Keat, of course, one of the greatest goalkeepers South Africa's ever produced. Thursday, World Cup winner James Dalton. And then Friday, I got a little something special. I was involved in a great project in Sweden last year. We will talk about that and the biggest youth football tournament in the world. So great week, action-packed week, and we've got the best in the world in the house tonight. So we got a really, really great way to start it off. And speaking of great people, I do have the lovely Woude Muller with me today. Woude, what's happening?
Hey, all good, all good. It was a good weekend. It was actually nice weather in Cape Town for a change. So COVID didn't exist in Cape Town this weekend, that's for sure. And everyone was out and about and enjoying the sunshine. For sure.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen. I mean, Cape Town's really been trying to unflatten the curve since the very beginning, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But we're on it, I think. And I'm sure Ross would be able to tell you much more about what's really happening on the COVID side. But here we are.
Yeah, and hey, the Ross, if you are just joining us, the Ross Woude is talking about is not some plain Jane Ross who works at a coffee shop somewhere. This is this is Professor Ross Tucker, the voice of sports science around the world. And Woude, what you guys going to talk about today?
So we're going to talk a little bit in general, what world rugby does when there's actually no rugby on. How are they looking at things? What do they want to change? Where are they going? Kind of what direction? Also a little bit on transgender policies in women's rugby, and then just how COVID has affected rugby in all over the world and also in South Africa now that we're going back with return to play. What needs to happen and what needs to change?
All right. So I'm really, really looking forward to hearing from a scientific point of view, especially the transgender conversation, which you're going to have. If you didn't see Ross's social media and Twitter today, it was ablaze. So I'm looking forward to hearing that. And, of course, the Real Science of Sport podcast is a banger in general. It is awesome. If you're into more than just what you hear in the plain Jane media, not us, of course, because we big J journalists, but there are other journalists out there that talk about nonsense. But, hey, Real Science of Sport podcast, I cannot wait to listen to the latest one. But we're gonna talk a little bit to Professor Ross Tucker, and Woude will have him on in a bit. Looking forward to that, Woude. Let us get into it. So we're gonna get into a little bit of what happened on the weekend. So I'm a football fan. By the way, NBA. If you're into NBA and you have not seen what Luka Doncic did last night, I ended up staying up till like 1 a.m. because I thought, what is going on? The Clippers, it was around 100 all. And I thought, no, there's no way. Surely they figure them out. Game 3 or it's game 4 now. They kind of figure this thing out. Luka Doncic has just gone mental. He's 21 and he dropped a 43-point triple-double last night. And the winner, he shot from Ljubljana. He shot it from Slovenia all the way to America. It was an insane buzzer beater and just awesome. So, I mean, that series, 2-2. The Clippers struggling. Paul George I don't think those shoulders have recovered. So, my God, sport is back in a big way. The playoffs are sizzling. They are sizzling. But talking about big sports, of course, the sports event, arguably the biggest football match in the world, happened on the weekend. Champions League final. Real thing, huh? Real thing, by the way. PSG, München, Mia San Mia, they say. The real Munchcraft. They were unbelievable with Bayern Munich. They really were unbelievable in terms of, once again, they are everything, right? They have the power. They're your typical German side, efficient and functional. But then they've got Thiago Alcantara. I mean, that was the difference. That was the difference. I think the lack of Verratti on the side of PSG meant a lot of their possession was hurried counterattack. And yes, they had some chances. but that was more the brilliance of Mbappe and his physical, sort of freakish nature, than your clear-cut. I mean, there was one where Mbappe had a weak finish, but I think without Verratti, they couldn't really construct moves. They were rather counter-attacking and looking for those sort of through balls and looking to beat for pace. But an interesting part, of course, was Neymar. And I just, I'm getting older. I think I'm getting a little bit more grumpy as I get older. But I'm really, as I get older, I'm really into hanging out with smart people. I'm getting smart people. And one of the things for me is smart people aren't people that are just book smart, right? That doesn't interest me. I have no problem saying I'm relatively smart. I've studied whatever, BSc, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't matter. Like, I'm smart. Anyone can read a book, right? But I'm into really smart people, because what I mean by smart people is people that make good decisions for a long time in life. So now I get to hang out with I've got mentors. I've got people that are really successful in my industry that I talk to often. And they've all got something in common, is they all make good decisions over long periods of time. If you're in programming or in philosophy, you call it a concatenation, right? You need a concatenation of events before you get the results you want, right? You got to get to that tipping point, but you need a series of good events. But people that claim to be smart and are not smart are people that want to be happier than happy. Like, there's nothing that revolts me more than people that want to be happier than happy. Listen, don't try and be too smart. Like, those are idiots. Don't try to be too smart. Don't try and be happier than happy. If you're happy, take it. So few people are happy. So few people have a great job. So few people have a great boss. And you know how I spot intelligent people? Is they don't care what people have to say. Smart people, they don't care what people have to say. Is, egotistical people, the people that pretend to be smart, big egos, talk a lot, is they want to be right instead of getting it right. And it sounds like the same thing. It sounds like the same thing, because you get in an argument with somebody who's an egotistical animal. In the moment, they want to win the argument, right? Smart people win the long game. They don't want to be right in the moment. What's the long-term approach? You fight with your girlfriend, you fight with your wife. Sometimes take the L in the moment, win the war. But idiots who I don't hang around with, by the way, I'm hanging around with them less and less, is people that want to be happier than happy. In 2015, the MSN connection existed at Barcelona, right? And the superstar who lost on Sunday or yesterday was Neymar. Everybody's been telling me how great this guy is. And I've been saying for 2 weeks, by the way, you can go and check my Twitter from 3 weeks ago. And I love being the guy saying, I told you so. I said, you're not winning the Champions League with Neymar and Mbappe. I'm sorry. So intelligent people, when they're happy, they don't want to be happier than happy. And Neymar did a power move in his mind, right? He wanted to get it right. It's like, okay, we've won the Champions League now. We've won the treble. Let me get out of here. Do you know what he wanted? He wanted the credit. That's what idiots do. Idiots want the credit. That's the type of idiots I'm talking about, who seem like to everybody, and then all the people on Twitter gas you up, right? Is, yeah, no, you're the man. You left Messi behind. You left Suarez behind. You show them. You're going to go do it by yourself. What an idiot. Honestly, what an idiot. Is you could have stayed there. They could have won 3-4 Champions Leagues together. Why do you want the credit? Go and win. Go and make all the money in the world. But everything about Neymar has shown me, right, that he doesn't think. You look at the stuff on social media. You look at the stuff with the model in the hotel. Listen, when people show you who they are, believe them. And that's who he is, right? That's who Neymar is I'm going to do flashy stuff. I'm going to try and get social appeal, maybe not make such great decisions. And now it's not like I'm looking at one piece of evidence. From the very beginning, him and his father, the move from Santos to Barcelona, what happened? Tax issues. His father apparently siphoning money. So that's already at 19. Listen, by 19, if you're making bad decisions at 19, and I have to say I was doing that, right? Bad decisions at 19, listen, it's followed me in my life as well. So when a guy at 19 is making bad decisions, that's before he got the money. It's no wonder that he's going to do the stuff with the model in the hotel. It's no wonder that the smart decision is stay with the greatest footballer of all time, right? And you stay with one of the greatest strikers of our generation. You go on and win 3, 4, 5 Champions League. You're a legend forever. Messi retires in 2 years. You're still 30. You take over that legacy at Barcelona. An organized club, an established structure. No, Neymar, it's about me. It's not about my legacy. It's not about making big money long term. No, it's about me. It's about now. When he lost yesterday, I'm not surprised. There's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you don't know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, it affects generally people that think they're smarter than they are. And people that are smart often underestimate themselves. People that aren't that smart overvalue themselves. And you've seen that with Neymar's behavior over and over. Don't try and be happier than happy. Don't try and be happier than happy. And that's what Neymar went for. He was part of the great, possibly the greatest dynasty after Pep's team afterwards. They went and won the treble under Enrique. I want to be the man. I've got no time for people like that. Don't try and be happier than happy. Dave, show me the second graphic. I mean, we got a graphic here of Neymar walking past the trophy. And I saw messages of people feeling sorry for Neymar. This is his doing. £189 million. And they're talking about is staying PSG his route to greatness. Is there anything? Listen, you got to believe what the guy is now. All right, one bad mistake with his dad. Okay, you accept that. The model stuff. Really? Really? Then you go and leave the greatest player of all time in his peak, in your peak, just so you can get more credit. I'm out. I feel nothing for him. It's over now. He's not winning at PSG. Forget it. It's done. He's shown you he's not the guy. He's not the guy because he doesn't make good decisions. And you know when making bad decisions and bad character is revealed? When things get difficult. When things are all going well, no problem. No problem. And there's nowhere to hide in today's age because when you do something with a model, it's a character thing again. It's on social media. We see that now. And it's not a highlights package now. We've seen a few things with Neymar that says, this guy's not serious. So I'm not going to don't ever compare him to Ronaldo. Don't ever compare him to Messi. I don't want to hear it. Because part of greatness, he's a good player. Right? I know lots of talented people. I'm not impressed by talented people. They're like, I'm a talented person. Right? I'm not impressed by you being talented. What I'm impressed by you is make good decisions constantly. Those are the types of people I want in my life. Neymar has shown that he is incapable of making a series of good decisions. And he got what he deserved last night, whether you like it or not. Listen, I'm happy for him. Get all the money in the world. I don't want to hear about great footballer. Don't ever compare him to Leo Messi again. Don't compare him to Cristiano Ronaldo. What's the difference? Both have made decisions that have ensured that they will win over and over and over. Cristiano Ronaldo, by the way, could have left Real Madrid just before Zidane came. After Mourinho, it was a nightmare. During Mourinho, it was a nightmare. Ronaldo had the tax case coming up. Real Madrid didn't back him. He was smart enough to say, hey, you know what? I've got a legacy to build. Let's go win 3 in a row. Gareth Bale came into town. Ronaldo hadn't been able to win the Champions League. Ronaldo could have sulked and said, I want to get out of here. I want the credit. What did Ronaldo do? Knuckle down. Bale's the second best player or third best player in the world at that stage. Is we compete Messi. What? The second and the best third player in the world? We're going to beat Messi. I don't need the credit. I'm Cristiano Ronaldo. I'm secure in myself. I'm smart enough to say, here's the place for me. They go win 3 in a row. Neymar won a treble. What did he say? I want the credit. Got out of town. Don't try and be happier than happy, people. I feel nothing for Messi. He got what he deserved. And quite frankly, Munich are unstoppable. So this is it. This is the last time I ever want to hear Messi's great, Messi's Hazard. Messi. He's not. Part of being great is making good decisions. And I'm done. I don't want to hear Neymar being compared to Hazard. And people think I'm talking about sort of Ronaldo and Messi. I don't even want to hear him being compared to Hazard. Hazard has made great decisions. He's been unlucky with the injury this year, but he left in a very classy fashion. Real Madrid are going to look after him. Don't you worry. Eden Hazard's going to win a Champions League title at Real Madrid. You do not need to worry about that. How do I know that? Eden Hazard has done nothing but make great decisions in his life. He left Lille. He came to Chelsea, settled down, was the best player in the English Premier League for 6-7 seasons. Now he's gone to the biggest club in the world at Real Madrid, They'll settle down. Next season, he'll be in great shape. They'll build the team around him, and he'll go on to be a dynasty. Neymar, I'm afraid, listen, don't have flaky people in your life. And now it's clear. Neymar's flaky. Because he tried to force a move out of Paris Saint-Germain when it wasn't going so well. I'm sorry, I don't want to hear it. So you force your way out of Barcelona, which was messy, by the way. It was a really messy way to live. His move from Santos, messy, corruption, stealing money, like this guy. So this is what you deserve, I'm afraid. Don't try to be happier than happy, people. This is what you get. No sympathy, and I don't want to hear great and Neymar named in the same sentence ever again. I just don't want to hear it. Dogo's on my jaws. He says, was it really about credit? I get your point, but it would have been great had the move to PSG worked out. Barca is Team Messi, and I guess that he wanted PSG to be Team Neymar. Part of greatness is accepting your place in life. He tried to be happier than happy. You stick with Messi, you go on and build a dynasty. I tell you what people remember is, my God, you were part of a great dynasty. You were part of something special. Let me make a basketball example. Kyrie Irving left LeBron James, right? Left LeBron, and it got messy. He went to Boston. They kicked him out after a season. He's in Brooklyn now, and it's kind of clear. Kyrie, you were the problem. Listen, you get divorced the first time, right? And your wife then, okay, she might have been terrible. You get divorced the second time, it's like, okay, maybe you were unlucky again. The other person might have been carrying baggage from their last relationship. I'm sorry, a third time, that's a you problem. Neymar now left Barcelona in a messy fashion. He left Santos in a messy fashion. Now he wants to leave PSG, try to force a move last season. I'm sorry, that's a you problem. Divorced 3 times, that's a you problem. I don't want to hear it. And the fact that Neymar wanted the credit is ridiculous. Messi's the greatest player. Go and be happy. Like, you were already happy. You're in football nirvana. No, but I want to be the guy. Forget it. I'm done with it. And I'm done with ever hearing Neymar is this and that. Forget it. He's a pin-up boy. Him and Pogba, they just pin-up boys and they sell boots, which is awesome. Go get all the money. I don't want to hear great footballer, though. Good and great. Big difference. The great make good decisions, a concatenation of solid decisions. Dogozi says, Neymar is a good player, one of the best. If we're just looking at his ability to play football, his decisions are horrible, but he is a great player. I think he's a very good player. To be great, you need the ability to make good decisions. Greatness isn't for everyone, right? There's a clear distinction between very good, right? And then there's great. And great is when you separate yourself. Neymar's done nothing to separate himself from the rest. He stays you got to be smart. Warren Buffett, you know why he's great? Long game. Smart. When do you ever hear Warren Buffett taking the credit for Berkshire Hathaway owning 7% of Coca-Cola? Never. He always talks about the great team around me. I'm very lucky with the people I've got. When you hear of the people that started Mac, what does he say? Wozniak. He always says, Steve Jobs couldn't have done it without him. Listen, appreciate your place in life. Neymar, you were a cog with the greatest of all time. You try to be happier than happy. The football ability is one part. Across the board in life, I'm not impressed by talent. There's lots of talented people. Make good decisions. Make good decisions, and then you become great. That's the difference. Speaking of greatness, a man that probably spent 400 years in university. My God, I don't even know what it takes to get a Ph.D. I'll never get near it. I failed university 2 years and barely got a BSc. Barely. Right? What do they say? I graduated, thank you, Lordy. Yeah. Like, thank you, Lordy. That was my degree. But this man coming up next, the guy, the voice of sports science around the world, he's too humble because he doesn't suffer from Dunning-Kruger effect. Smart people, like I told you, will always underplay their greatness. But it is an honor to have the great Professor Ross Tucker. He's coming up next. Welcome back to it, folks. Before we get to Professor Tucker, Dave, shall we take some questions? Let's take some questions. See if you got any YouTube comments for me there, Dave. And I know Dogozo had something to say. Dogozo Majosi, Messi also wants to leave Barca right now. No one wants to be part of a bad team. I totally agree. So, Dogozo, I think there's a very interesting situation developing there. Sometimes powerful people need to kind of tell you that they've got a bit of power. And I think Bartomeu, I don't expect him to last. I expect him to lose that battle with Messi. I think Messi is making it clear. Remember, sometimes these powerful people is Messi and his agent will be planning a power move. Is you play the media, right? What is the old philosophical saying is you win the mob, you win the war. That's a part of it, right? Is you manage the perception on the front and you kind of eke out Bartomeu, and then Messi will come back once they're happy because he's not going anywhere. He's not going anywhere. He knows there's nowhere in the world where he will be God like he is at Barcelona. Now what he wants to do, and I'm pretty solid on this, is he wants to force Bartomeu out. Now the prodigal son has come home. Ronald Koeman has come home. I think what that'll do is they'll go back to old school Barcelona ways. Expect next season less transfers. Of course, we've already seen a man who's got COVID. The COVID-19 came off the top rope and dropped the elbow in his throat in Pjanic. But I think they'll go for more Dutch players, schooled much like the La Masia players, and they'll go back to the La Masia team. You expect more Barcelona B team players, and expect Leo Messi to have more control and roster control from here on in. So I think that's a bit of media power from Messi exercising to say, get rid of this guy because it's been a mess for 2 years. I'm sick of him since he let Enrique go. So I think there might be a bit more to that story. But in terms of making good decisions, I'm sorry, I can't change on Neymar. I'm not impressed by talent. There's lots of talented people. Really great people make good decisions as well with that talent. And with that, talented and making great decisions long enough to get a Ph.D. and be the guy. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Professor Ross Tucker. With me.
You just start talking.
Hey, Ross, we were having some technical difficulties. Sorry, Professor Ross Tucker. Sorry, I never got that. Professor Ross Tucker. You deserve it. And you are a humble man, but I love your work. I've been a huge fan for a long time. It's the second time we've had the honor of having you on. So, Ross, thank you so much for coming on. And I'm really, really looking forward to your chat with Woude.
Yeah, thanks. It's cool to chat to you again. I quite enjoy a bit of banter and discussion about sports. It's always good. I consider myself someone whose hobby is my job, so it's pretty cool to talk to people about what their hobby is. So, never turn down a chance.
Do what you love. Hey, do what you love. You'll never work a day in your life, they say, Professor. This is why you're at the top. So I'll let you guys get to it. Woude Muller and Ross Tucker. I think Woude's having gremlins in Cape Town. There, I think her mic's got COVID. It's gonna happen. So, Prof, I mean, we could maybe get into it while we try and get Woude back. Let me know. So, what's been interesting for you? I mean, you guys are going to unpack a few things. Some of the things that were interesting to me, I saw your article or your tweet about Josh Cheptegei and his world record. I mean, that was just out of this world. What are we thinking? I mean, we're in a space now where I'm a huge athletics fan, but every time, and he's great. I mean, I was fortunate to MC an event in South Africa where he ran the fastest 10K ever run in South Africa, in Durban. What do we think of him breaking that world record? And what are your thoughts? Should we always be skeptical now, or is running still pretty clean? Because I'd like to believe.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have to be skeptical. I hate to be the cynic in the room in most conversations, but you have to be, because history has shown us that the disincentives to dope, so in other words, the ability of anti-doping to catch dopers, is clearly well below what the incentives are. So the rewards for dopers are enormous, and the punishment for doping is so small and so unlikely. So I don't know if you can go back 30 years and find many clean performances, and that's the big problem. So when you see another performance that is better than anything humans have ever achieved before, then of course you have to regard it with cynicism. And the other reason for skepticism now, and it's such a frustrating one because it was so avoidable, is that they failed to regulate footwear. And you shouldn't ever watch an athlete running and then have questions on the finish line about whether his shoes gave him a 5 to 10 second benefit compared to the guys that he beat and the guy whose record he broke. So that record was set in 2004, 16 years ago. That guy was running in a completely different pair of shoes to Chepter guys. So now all of a sudden, how do you evaluate the performance in the context of history? You can't do it. And that, by definition, undermines a world record, because a world record in running is meant to represent the pinnacle of human physiology and physical capability in all of humankind. And now all of a sudden he's got better shoes, and those are worth, you see, if those shoes are worth 3 seconds, that's not a world record. And that's the problem. And they could have, you see, they could have stopped that from happening. They could have just come in at the beginning and said, we will not allow this type of shoe, but they didn't. And now all of a sudden nobody knows what's going on. So I hate to be negative and cynical, but I mean, it's like you should be celebrating at 12:35 going like, oh my goodness, but actually you're going and you're saying, yeah, but 2 seconds here, 3 seconds there, I don't know what to make of it.
Sure. And so when somebody like Sebastian Coe has to have this type of conversation, are they just closed off to even the hint of giving it a scientific sort of legitimacy? Because now, unfortunately, I kind of feel like running is being still run like it was 1830, where the public and the plebs, which is us, doesn't have information, isn't allowed to be able to read. Like, no. 70% of society now, generally in all developing and developed world countries, can write and read. We understand fundamental science. Are they just closed this type of conversation, or is the machine? Because I mean, it's about money, right? As well. Like we got to be honest. If Nike, Adidas say, "Listen, we got to get on this thing and back a runner," do the IAAF just look the other way? Well, what is the story there? I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I can try. The problem they've got is that they've got conflicting incentives. So they sit down, and on the table there is a argument against commercial influence, financial pressure, Nike basically owning the sport. And they know that. I mean, they're not stupid people, so they understand exactly what is at stake there. On the other side, there is a pile of arguments that will say sporting integrity, honesty, trust, and so on in the performances. And I think that sports organizations get into trouble because they try and balance the two. And when you try to balance the two, then even your good intentions can lead you to doing things that are not necessarily good. And like I work in rugby now, as you know, and I think rugby also, with every intention in the world, tries to do this. So you might know that rugby now has got arguments about the calendar. People are saying players play too much and it's harmful, it's anti-player welfare. Those people who have meetings to discuss the calendar, they are well aware of the player welfare concerns. So they don't go in there and pretend they don't exist. They actually prioritize it. It's the first item on every meeting. But there's so much tension between the player welfare incentives and the commercial incentives that in the end, when they try and juggle it, they're going to drop one of them, and then it looks the way that it does. And I think that's what's happened in athletics. They've tried to balance these different incentives, and you just can't do it. So you have to have, I think, quite an uncompromising attitude, and you have to say, The number one priority is integrity. Therefore, take your spring-reloaded carbon fiber bouncy shoes and sell them to the masses, but we're not letting it into the elite level of the sport. But they don't. You see, they say, maybe we can find a compromise position. Maybe we can balance this, keep you happy and them. And in the end, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I think a lot of the time there are good intentions. A lot of the time there are not. You genuinely have dishonest people who are corrupt. But I've also come to see that actually sometimes good people do the wrong thing because they just can't juggle when they should have prioritized.
So I love what you're saying. And, two sports I'm a huge fan of and I think are the model in America. Whether they're clean or not, we can get to that. But do you think the UFC and the NFL having a commissioner and Dana White, it's very clear where the blame lies for decisions? Because it kind of feels to me like some other sports is decisions by committee. It eventually becomes, it's the FIFA mess. It's like, where does the buck actually stop? So do we maybe need to change the model? Is because now, as much as we say Sebastian Coe, but then, running associations in the UK, here, some people test VADA, some people are happy with UCAD, so, whereas Dana White's very clear. Here are the parameters. If you don't come with VADA, you may not fight in my cage. Like the NFL, Roger Goodell. Here, do we maybe need to relook at the model of sports like running in order to clean up? Would that help? Do you see the UFC and those sort of, you hate to say dictatorial, but where it's clear there is a czar? Do you think that might be better?
Well, you may know a little bit more about those than I do, but like if you think NFL, there are 32 teams and then their owners pretty much make the decisions. What do they do when Roger Goodell stands up in front of them and says, we're going to do X, Y, Z, and 17 of the 32 owners say not a chance? How do they resolve that dispute? Because it feels to me that they also, in the end, have a situation where the tail wags the dog, which I think is the situation in rugby. Like, I mean, you look a couple of years ago, South Africa was the front runner to win hosting rights for the 2023 World Cup. And World Rugby, and this is another example of like really good intentions, they made it very transparent and clear how the different bids, there was France, Ireland, South Africa, were being evaluated, and we came out on top, and everyone knew that. But then when the vote happened, it went to France because of political lobbying and so on, and it's just a bad look. But that's inevitably going to happen when you allow committees to vote over and above what the central control is doing. So I'd ask you, how does the NBA deal, and the NFL, how do they deal with disputes like that? Because I don't know that their model is that much better.
Yeah, I think, that is an interesting question. So in the NFL, it seems like the deference generally is, what does Jerry Jones have to say, and what does Robert Kraft have to say? They seem to be that. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, if he could just stay out of the nightclubs, or if he could stay out of the exotic dance clubs, he'd do fine. But I think they tend to defer to that, and I think you are making a great point. There is always that tension between economic and sort of integrity based. But I think one thing they do is they do have Roger Goodell. Is, for me at least, there's somewhere to point the blame. With the IAAF, I almost feel like Sebastian Coe, and then he'll tell you, federations must run it themselves. It's kind of like FIFA, it's like Infantino, but then he'll tell you, no, we don't get involved in COSAFA, in CAF, and then sometimes they do. And then for me, what I like about Dana White's model, I believe, and I think I heard Eddie Hearn in boxing coming to this, and I want to come to boxing, is Dana White at least is, I'm over here and I make the rules, right? And that tightens the window where when Ross Tucker comes and he says, but Dana, I spoke to you. Now, if you go and say you've recommended to athletics, I'd like to hear what they would say to you is, yes, we've got to, or what would they say when you say, okay, I've presented to Lord Coe why the shoes and why the testing sort of decentralized sort of, the guys don't have anything to incentivize them not to cheat, or however you may term it. What is that jargon like from their side?
He'll say, yes, we've heard you and you've made very compelling points, but we've also heard 3 or 4 other arguments, and we have to try and balance all these arguments, and you end up in that same situation where you haven't prioritized in the right way, and you don't stand firm with your convictions. Your moral and your business convictions are too loose, And as a consequence, a compelling argument nudges you here. And it just takes 3 or 4 nudges, and next thing you're heading in the completely wrong direction. So I think that's the fundamental problem, is that they are trying to juggle. And that's why, like UFC with Dana White, NASCAR was the same. I think it was a family-owned business, and they could pretty much make any decision and then tell people what to do. The moment you have to ask people what to do, you lose power. So I'll never forget, I used to watch House of Cards. I'm sure you watched the show. And that
I did a little bit, yeah.
That TV show was really compelling for 2 seasons, and then he became the president, and it lost its appeal because he lost power. So there was it stopped being intriguing. And I know this is a super tangent. I know you like a tangent, but I think the same is true in sports. Is that unless you really have centralized power, like you have to try and always keep your constituents happy, and then you lose the ability to sometimes do the right thing, but maybe you end up doing the best thing. It's a tricky one for sport. I mean, I see it in rugby now. Every decision is a consultative process, and that's good. I'm not arguing for not consulting, but when you consult even 5 people and they're split 3-2, then what do you do? So
this is such a good point, and I think what you're referring to there is, if you haven't read Machiavelli's The Prince, I highly recommend that to people. Is there are kings and there are kingmakers, and it's often argued that often you look at the very basis of the law we go by today, the Magna Carta. Everybody thinks John signed that willingly, but if you understand the history of that, is that the earls and the bishops really ran the country from there and wrote the Magna Carta and shaped law as we know today fundamentally, and sort of the social compact we have today. And I think you see a sort of symptom of that. But Ross, one thing I'd like to also ask you is, I'm a big fan of contact sports. So UFC, okay, I love it. I like Dana White. And I just want to say, where there's dictatorship again, where it's brilliant, and you've seen them in COVID be excellent, is Vince McMahon with the WWE. No matter what you think of them, is a clear leader, one direction, no consulting. This is what we do. We're going to be aggressive, and the product will push forward. So, and I guess the old saying is, everybody likes the idea of a dictatorship. Nobody wants to live in a dictatorship. So sometimes it's
because you can say they're going to push forward and do the best thing and so on, but they're doing the best thing for themselves. And in the absence of any control, and now we're getting into like politics in effect. In the absence of any control, then who suffers is the constituents, because their priorities and incentives are not managed. So, UFC's gotten away with sport during COVID, and WWE, I guess, has. I don't really follow enough to know, but they've also been forced to be quite compliant. I mean, I've watched some of the UFC, and they've taken precautions to stop sport from becoming the trigger for a cluster and an outbreak that affects communities. So he's not entirely able to just do his own thing. But, there need to be checks and balances. Otherwise, unrestricted power becomes damaging, obviously.
Sure. Yas Island, Fight Island he went to. But, I think you're completely right. So I'd like to speak to you about boxing, because for me, that is, a vital sport, the purest sport for me. And I absolutely love it. I'm a football guy, but boxing is special to me. In contact sport, right, is the notion that guys are allowed to dope, be caught, and come back again. You dope in athletics, you dope in cricket, you dope in, to some extent, football. Okay, maybe we do 5 years, you come back, or whatever it is. When you dope in boxing, how long does it take? I'm a heavyweight now. How long does it actually take for those benefits, right, to be out of my system? Is that even scientifically a valid question? Because in boxing, you can kill somebody. It's not like football. It's not like cricket. I'd love to hear your thoughts on rugby, boxing. Should we not take it more seriously in these sports where you can end a life?
Yes, you should, is the short answer to that. Obviously, as always, there's a lot of detail. The challenge with... So the question around how long does doping benefit persist is a very important one. It's one of the fundamental questions. It's never really been studied, because ethically, how do you do it? Do you give 50 boxers banned steroids and then assess them over the course of 10 years, where they stop after 5 and you see if they stay as strong? So it's not really known. There are some studies in mice where they've given them steroids and they found that the effects persist for the lifetime of that mouse. So and there's a phenomenon called cellular memory where at the level of the DNA in the cells, it seems like the testosterone effects never actually go away. So that's an argument for lifetime effect of doping, which is an argument for lifetime bans for doping, because once you've cheated, you are always a beneficiary of cheating, even when you're no longer actively cheating. Makes sense? Now, whether that is...
So it's like my old relationship. I cheated and it was never the same again.
You're always a cheat from that moment forward.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. So it's the same thing. Yeah, it's applicable.
And so whether you get a lifetime ban from future relationships, or in our case, sport, is the question. Now, so would you allow someone who's been convicted of embezzling money to work in a bank? Probably not. That crime penalizes them for life. They're allowed to come back into society and do something else, but you wouldn't, in the same way, and this is dark, but like you wouldn't let a pedophile teach at a school. You'd be stupid, no. Because he's shown his pattern before and you wouldn't let him come in. So people argue and they say, okay, well, we shouldn't allow dopers to come back into sport. We'll allow them back into society, no problem, and we'll forgive the guy for doping, but no second chances. The biggest reason that can't happen, because there are a lot of people who would like it to happen, is that if you set the punishment as a lifetime ban, then your legal system that catches the doper and prosecutes the doper has to be absolutely bulletproof. Because if it's not, and you start giving lifetime bans to people who are only 90% likely guilty or could be dopers, but maybe you can't prove it, then your punishment doesn't fit your crime, if that makes sense. So it's, again,
sure.
using criminal justice. You don't sentence people to death because he might have done it. You have to be sure. Absolutely 100% sure. And the problem with doping is that the level of evidence that is brought in a doping trial is never that good. You never have a smoking gun with a guy sitting there with a needle in his arm and a confession and 20 witnesses and DNA evidence and blah, blah, blah. Because he's going to say, I took a supplement and it was contaminated. And now all of a sudden you're sitting with a lifetime ban because you took a supplement. So it's out of proportion. So, and the consequence of that, by the way, would be that every single doper would get a lifetime ban, but now they would fight that thing tooth and nail. They wouldn't accept it because a 2-year ban, I'll take that because, 2 years, it's like COVID. It's 2 years of COVID, no fights. That's okay, I'll deal. But a lifetime ban, I'm fighting. So all of a sudden the legal system would break because so many people would be fighting lifetime bans doping. So it's a theoretical solution, but not a real one. For now.
Yeah, and for now, yeah. So it looks like we've got Woude back. Prof, I want to ask you one more question. We tried to get him on the show. Unfortunately, we couldn't. Maybe in the future. We had a situation with Chili Boy Ralapela. I don't know if you've had... I mean, I'd imagine you've got your opinion. Is it a position you're willing to maybe speak on? Because I think, through your experience, and you're a man that understands forest plots and things like this and analyzing data far better than I ever will. When somebody is caught for the third time, I mean, are we actively looking to catch people out? I don't believe we are. Does he have any leg to stand on?
He might, The first one was an accidental supplement ingestion, and he and Bjorn Besson tested at the same time, and both of them were cleared because, remember, what they'd shown there was that they took a supplement that an independent body had guaranteed was clean, and it wasn't. So the liability shifts from them to someone else, and they were able to say, we did everything we possibly could to avoid doping, and we still fell foul of it. So that's an example where imagine a lifetime ban and you've actually done all you could have done. A disaster. The second one, as I understand it, is he fessed up to. So he's a one-time doper. I believe, I haven't seen enough and I don't know the case personally, I believe that his third one is going to be a food contamination case. Now, that has happened. There was an American 800-meter runner recently, a woman who was the best in the world last year, and she was cleared of a doping offense because she was able to show that she'd eaten steak that had been contaminated with steroids. So it can
Is
happen.
That clenbuterol?
It has been clenbuterol in the past. Hers was something else. It was a name with a Z that I forget. Zeranol, I think it was, or something. Recently, there was a long jumper called Jarian Lawson, who's an Olympic medalist, who had the same case, and he was able to show similarly that he hadn't doped, but he'd actually ingested the steroid in meat. Now, the standard we ask our athletes to get to is, okay, don't take supplements recklessly. I'm all behind that, because if you're a professional athlete, you've got two major risks in your life. The one is that you get a career-threatening or ending injury, and the other one is a doping ban. So if you are that athlete and you walk into a pharmacy and you say, or a discount, whatever it is, and you say, I'm going to take this, this, and this, that's actually the height of recklessness. There's very little you can do that's so reckless for your own career. So if you fail a drugs test, I have very little sympathy for you. So there's a responsibility on athletes. But are you going to ask an athlete to now try and vet the steak that he eats when he goes out for dinner with his mates? That seems to me to be like a little bit too much. I mean, are you going to ask an athlete every time he eats meat to keep a piece? So that if he fails a drugs test, he can have the piece of meat analyzed and show, look, it was in my meat. So
sure.
I feel sympathy for the athlete like that, and I don't know how Chili Boy is going to prove that, or whether there's going to be some other way to do it. But it shows you the only way they can prove that is you've got to do a criminal investigation. You've got to produce receipts. You've got to have eyewitnesses, and you've got to investigate the restaurants and check where they got their cows from, who farms those cows, interview the farmers, check whether, I mean, this is actually like law and order now, not sport anymore.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're talking about Canelo Alvarez, probably the biggest money turner in boxing right now. Clem Buterol claimed the same thing, Mexican boxers for a long time. It seems the steak in Mexico is... it is not stable in Mexico. Who knows what they're feeding us? So, no, very interesting.
Right, so that's an example. That's an example where, like, they know that Chinese meat and Mexican meat is dodgy. Now, that's an example where the athletes should probably take some precautions, because even if there's a 1 in 1,000 chance, why would you take that risk? You can go somewhere else and have the same meat or something else. So that's an example where I'm less sympathetic. But if you've had that meat in the United States or South Africa or France, that's a tough ask for the athletes.
You're hitting on a point, and sanctimonies, whatever. I have to put it out there. I don't like to sit on the fence. When I went to Tottenham and then Watford, is they sit you down. One of the first things they do as a junior, they sit you down and they say, anything that goes into your mouth is your responsibility. Like, that is one of the first things they told us. That wasn't like they were hiding it in the corner and we're going to catch you out. So to me, I'm always... maybe it's because I hold and love sportsmen so much. I'm always so flabbergasted when guys are caught up. But as you say, when you really look under the carpet, it's not cut and dry. So, Prof, I mean, yeah, unbelievable insights as always. And I can't wait to maybe have you back, and we'll open up in that conversation. Looks like we do have Woude Muller back. So, Prof, I'll let you and Woude do your thing, ladies and gentlemen. Woude Muller and Ross Tucker for the third time.
Well, I'm going to try. Can you hear me now? Yes, no, is it coming through? I hope so. Well, it's been an interesting night, and it's been an interesting time in rugby. And as we know, New Zealand was back playing, but now there's also been new cases in New Zealand that have popped up, and they're to move their north-south derby. Rugby in Australia is back. They're also playing in the UK, or in the Europe now. And in South Africa, they're also trying to actually look at starting to play again. But obviously, there needs to be new rules and new things. But before we get to that, Ross, just tell us, what have you been working on in this time? Because every time I talk to you, like, I'm super busy with World Rugby stuff. So what were you busy with? Why were you so busy? What are you guys looking at the moment?
Yeah, so my job with World Rugby is to try and support decisions with data. Like, that's the simplest explanation I can give you. And so when COVID-19 hits and the whole world goes into lockdown, World Rugby didn't have any tournaments. I mean, we run the sevens, the under-20s, the women's game, and the elite men's World Cups. But Premiership, Super Rugby, Pro 14, Top 14, those are run by the unions. So in one respect, World Rugby was not directly affected by COVID-19 in terms of what happens between the lines. But in another respect, heavily affected, because all of a sudden all the unions wanted support, in the sense that they were looking at World Rugby to try and guide them through how rugby would come back. And remember, back in mid-March, nobody knew how long this thing was going to go for. People rather amusingly thought it was going to be 2 to 3 weeks. Turns out that was probably an order of magnitude underestimated. But so in the first month or two, all I was doing was gathering data. We were trying to read papers to understand how well testing works. In other words, how accurately can you test a player potentially for COVID? How quickly does that result come? How likely is that result to be true as opposed to a false positive or negative? If you test, can you play? What other methods of hygiene need to be in place? And so we basically started working on a document which was called the Return to Play Guidelines. And I was one of the authors of that. I contributed a lot of the data. We were trying to analyze papers. It was an intense. It was actually probably the hardest I've worked since I joined World Rugby, because everyone was trying to understand how rugby will come back, and they were looking at World Rugby for that guidance. Okay, cool. In hindsight, a lot of what we were doing was not irrelevant, but in the big picture of things, big scheme of things, sport was at the mercy of governments. If government said you can't have people gathering in groups of 10, then rugby wasn't going to be played. So we all just eventually had to learn to be patient, and hopefully now we're back to the point where we can actually start looking at what happens on the field again.
So from the point of view of the ruck laws that we saw implemented in the New Zealand and in the Australian games, and now also in Europe, what data did you guys find from that? How did it change the game? Did it make it quicker than what they expected? Did it make the game safer, which is what their intentions were? And from your side, what data did you collect from all of these games to see if it was successful or not?
Yeah, so the breakdown law was the very last rugby operational thing that we had before lockdown. So I remember being in a meeting. There was a meeting in Paris at the end of February where all the referees, players, coaches, and so on discussed it. And then it was decided upon. And the intention, obviously, was it was going to go the whole world. And then all of a sudden we went through, what was it, like 3 months with not a single game, maybe 2. So in actual fact, that was an upside of COVID, because now we could really consolidate, get the message out, and then see what happened in New Zealand. So what happened is that it sped up the ruck. The way the referees now assess the breakdown was designed to speed up ruck ball, because 2 things. One is you want a quicker game, because one of the things that's happened in rugby in the last 5 to 10 years, and we were probably the best at it, that's why we're the world champions, is that they learned how to slow the ball down at the ruck, which meant that they could then pressure with a line speed. And so the solution is, can we get quicker ruck ball, which then negates line speed? And if so, then the game becomes more attractive. And then the other reason you want a faster ruck is that it's safer, because we know that most of the bad injuries that happen in a ruck are when a player is cleaned out. And that tends to happen on slow ruck balls. So the ball's been in there for 3, 4, 5 seconds, and then there's a guy over the ball and he gets absolutely smashed, and that's an ACL and a career done. So the intention was to speed the ruck up, and that happened. So in New Zealand, the ruck speed, the average time of the ruck went from 3.1 seconds to 2.7, I think it was. I think in Australia, interestingly, it didn't change, which is in itself interesting. And it'll be very interesting to see how it looks in the north. But theoretically, yes, it sped up. It sped up at the cost of more penalties, which I know you know about. The number of penalties at the breakdown was up in the first few weeks in New Zealand to 15 to 20 a game, which a lot of people complained about. They're complaining in the north now about the same things, which is classic rugby fans that spite themselves with their objections. But anyway, so more penalties, but faster ball, and I think a better and more attractive game, and we think considerably safer, but that's too early to say.
So what did you need to see still from your side? Just more games to see if it's going to change that, more people that need to play, more injuries that need to happen or not? Because from what I've seen, there are actually quite a lot of injuries that happened in New Zealand. There were also a few injuries. We know Archie Snyman got injured in the first 7 minutes of his return and his debut at Munster this last weekend. So do you think that is from just not being conditioned enough and not going through enough contact training before they started, or is this just part of the game?
No, I think those injuries are partly freak accidental injuries, which do happen. I mean, a guy gets dropped at a line-out and he lands badly, that's a knee gone. Can you tell that apart from an overuse or an unprepared injury? I don't know. I mean, in that Leinster-Munster game, one of the guys went off with a hamstring. He was sprinting down the touchline and no one was within 5 meters of him, and he did a hammy. That's a classic overuse or unprepared injury. So one of 2 things is happening. Either they're not conditioned enough, or they've been under so much pressure to be match ready that they've overtrained and gone into the game carrying a little bit of fatigue. So I do think that the COVID calendar is going to cause an increase in injuries. We saw that in AFL, and it was the same in the Bundesliga. There were definitely more injuries than usual. So far, the ruck looks pretty good. I can't think of too many injuries in the ruck, but that needs a lot more cases, because the ruck accounts for about 10% of all injuries. So you probably have to watch 200 matches before you are able to conclude anything that's not just anecdote and guesswork. So we need to, and we will, by the end of next season, probably only be able to answer that question.
We've spoken about this a little bit, and I've kind of followed your whole Twitter, and I'm going to say discussions, because I know how heated you can get, even though it doesn't necessarily come through, but I've heard in our conversations, the whole transgender policies that you guys have also been working on at World Rugby. What is happening there? Just take someone who's not as intelligent as you, so someone like me, through kind of how did you get to this? What was scientifically what you had discussed and kind of proved, and then obviously from a social acceptance point of view, it's obviously two very different sides to this whole situation.
Yeah, it's the most complex problem in sport, because it has no solution. There's just a trade-off, and so the issue is this: when someone is born male, but then at some point in their life, whether it's early or later, identifies as female, then they have every right to do so. They are a transgender woman. Does that person's identification as a woman entitle them to play sport against women? Now, some listeners are listening and saying, like, that's ridiculous. Obviously not. Others might be saying, of course they are, because sport is not distinct from society. So if we recognize someone's rights to identify, then of course they should be allowed to play sport. The problem is that it's a question eventually of colliding rights, because the rights of that person to play women's sports mean that the rights of another person might be compromised, and those rights would be fairness and safety in a sport like rugby. So eventually what sport's trying to do, again, and it comes back to what I was talking to with Mbulela earlier, is it's trying to balance inclusion, which is a good thing. Like, society should respect and include people, against fairness and safety. And this is where it becomes difficult, because you cannot, I mean, this is in a conflict, but you can't balance those things. It's not possible to put all three on the same level and achieve inclusion, fairness, and safety. If you go with inclusion, you create risk and unfairness. If you go with fairness, you create exclusion, not inclusion. So what rugby has tried to do is to run what we think is a evidence-based, ethical, and inclusive process to come to a recommendation that we believe achieves the priorities that it should. And we did that. It's taken a lot of research and meetings and consultations. It included a 2-day meeting earlier this year where we had scientists, doctors, lawyers, ethicists, advocates for both sides, women's rights and trans rights. Big debate over the course of 2 days. And then we came up with a guideline which was leaked, unfortunately, a couple of weeks back. It's still in the consultation process. So it's gone out to all the unions, what World Rugby is advising. But yeah, that's the crux of it. So just to take a step back, we know that men outperform women in sports. I mean, that's not sexist to say that. It's just fact. It's biology. It's science. And those differences are massive. So running speed is 10 to 15% higher. Usain Bolt beats Shelley-Ann Fraser by 15%. She's the fastest woman in the world. There are 4,000 boys and men who are faster than her every season. So women's sport exists to protect fairness for women. And the biological differences are so massive that if you didn't do it, women would vanish entirely. So the question is, can you include biological males in women's sports somehow, or is it impossible? And that's basically the issue here.
So also talking about women's sport, obviously women's rugby, not as big as men's rugby, but I think World Rugby did say that they want to make women's rugby completely professional in 2025. We also have the World Cup next year. So where is World Rugby going with women's rugby? How are they making it more professional? What are they putting in from their side to make sure that women's rugby is getting to that level?
Yeah, so even more broadly, women's sport is not as big as men's sport. There are very few sports where they have equal standing. Tennis probably gets the closest. Track and field athletics, you have 2 Olympic champions in every event, and they are, for the most part, celebrated equally. Sometimes even, Simone Biles is an iconic athlete. Name the men's equivalent. There isn't one. So, but those are exceptions. For the most part, men's sport dominates the headlines, the money, the opportunities, and the attention. And so, in order to change that, you have to overinvest relatively in women's sport. That's the right thing to do. So World Rugby's tried to do that. They've recently appointed a woman called Kate Sadler, who is an outstanding manager and leader, and she's now in charge of the women's game. And they've driven a campaign called Try to Stop Us. They are working with the major unions. There is, as I say, relatively high or disproportionately high investments in those unions to try and lift the standard of the global game. The challenge, as always, is that World Rugby can't fund professional rugby in 10 competitions. So it can't pay the salaries of women in the USA, Canada, England, Wales, France, Ireland, Scotland, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. It's up to SA Rugby to produce the South African women's team. It's up to New Zealand Rugby to produce theirs, which they do, and we don't. So the problem is you're trying to guide investments and push it and so on, and that's very difficult. So World Rugby's contribution has been from the top down. It's been sponsorship. It's been to grow the Women's World Cup, which was very successful in 2017 in Ireland. It'll be in New Zealand next time. It should be even bigger there. And then hope that the investment at the top and the guidance that's provided to the unions from the bottom starts to pull the game up. It's the fastest growing division of rugby in the world, off an admittedly low base, and it needs to continue. And that's one of the reasons why this transgender thing is given the focus that it's given, because it threatens the integrity of women's rugby.
And also on the women's rugby point of view, obviously second tier rugby, I guess, is in that same kind of level than women's rugby. So what is World Rugby doing to focus on second tier rugby? Are they putting more focus on that? Are there going to be competitions? Are these second tier nations going to be part of it? I know Japan and Fiji going to be part of the Six Nations at the end of this year. So there were talks that they were going to be part of that. So what is World Rugby from doing that? So obviously everyone wants second tier rugby to be better. Everyone wants to up that. Everyone wants to see the second tier nations do better, but no one actually wants to take that money out of their pocket and say like, okay, we'll help you develop your country or your nation. So how are they going to do this? Who's going to give the money?
Yeah, this is another example. I mean, there's so many. Every issue you bring up brings up these organizational challenges. So World Rugby identifies tier 1 nations as the sort of Big Ten, the Six Nations up north and the rugby championship teams down south. Then in addition, you have the tier 2 nations, which are the other nations that participate in the Rugby World Cup. And then there are tier 3 nations like Brazil and Chile and Mexico. Korea, for instance, would be one of those. The other Pacific Islands, the Cook Islands and so on. And there is an investment program run by the High Performance Division of World Rugby that then looks to support them. Now, it's the same problem is we don't want to go in and run rugby in Fiji, but what we want to do is we want to support the Fiji Rugby Union to do their own job of doing it well. It's that whole teach a guy to fish as opposed to give a man a fish. So the support is provided in the form of coaching expertise and then high performance staff. So World Rugby employs medical, coaching, S&C, technical and tactical coaches, and referees who go and work with coaches and professionals in those territories. It's kind of a knowledge sharing platform program that they try and run it in that way. Then there are additional bursaries. So World Rugby provides money to all the rugby playing nations in the world. The tier 1 nations get a big chunk, obviously, of the TV rights deal that goes from the World Cup. So South Africa will see X million dollars over 4 years from that, and so will Australia and New Zealand. so do Fiji and those countries, but then in addition, they get another allocation for high performance sports, and they are audited every single year. There's a fairly comprehensive list of KPIs. Most listeners may know that. Key performance indicators. They have to show good governance. They have to show financial stability. They have to show professional player development, talent ID, player welfare, all that kind of stuff. And then they get the money allocated against those items. And so, they used to say, it was always, when I started there, it was 2015. The intention was to get a quarter finalist from a tier 2 nation by 2019. That was done, thanks to Japan. The same will be true in 2023, but they want 2. So Fiji and Japan would seem to be the likeliest. But at the same time, Tonga, Samoa, Georgia potentially could be elevated. USA is the big growth area now, obviously, with Major League Rugby there. So they're trying. They could always give more money. We know that. But I think, again, intentions are good. Barriers are large.
And anything else that's interesting that you think from World Rugby point of view that we need to know about now, or that we're allowed to know about, that World Rugby is looking at?
Gosh, I've been so COVID and transgender dominated in the last while that I don't really even know. Now that rugby is actually on the go, we'll see what happens in the next 3 to 6 months. The global calendar is going to be the big issue. COVID represents an opportunity to shake things up a little bit in that regard. Anyone who's followed rugby for the last 3 or 4 years knows that that's been an ongoing discussion. Another example of where you can't get past the stalemate when you have voting bodies within a body, because the Six Nations. So, for instance, take the Six Nations. They want relegation promotion, but Scotland and Italy will never vote for that, because that's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. So how do you convince people that like relegation is actually in their favor? Because the problem is that the pie has always been this large, and it's been sliced into, say, 6 pieces, not equal, but 6 pieces. Now you're saying we're going to slice it into 8, and everyone says, but that means I'm getting less of it. You've got to convince people that the pie is going to get bigger, so that 8 pieces is actually more than 6 pieces were. If relative, each person's piece is going to be larger than their 1/6. So that's the big challenge, and there are now discussions ongoing. I'm part of that from a player welfare perspective, is how do we synchronize the North-South calendar, and how is it going to be done with 6 nations, keeping the integrity there, and so on. It's a massive challenge. You can imagine, because everyone's got their own incentives, and they should. I mean, they're looking after their own property, their own patch of turf, but we've got to try and figure out a way to change it. You don't want to be in 20 years from now and the global rugby calendar looks the same, and we're saying, gee, Fiji are so close but not quite there. You want to get them to the level of Wales, Ireland, us. So that's the big thing that'll come in the next 6 months.
And then from the South African point of view, because someone asked me this question and I couldn't really answer them. They asked, when's Currie Cup coming back? When's South African rugby back? There's been this whole thing that they might start in mid-September, but they haven't done, as far as I know, they're not allowed to do contact training yet. And from your genius point of view, you know how long you need to take to get that contact back. I think before, even in normal circumstances, I think it's about, 8 weeks that they have this proper return to play, return to contact kind of whole situation. And then also the whole situation with the biodome that they want to put the players in. Do you think that will work? Do you think it's going to be worth it? Or do you think rather just don't play rugby and just be safe and wait until we can?
Yeah, mid-September is the date I've also heard. I'm not sure that there's a firm commitment to a date, because I think they are working with the coaches and the teams to see exactly how quickly they can, get contact introduced and then use that contact to get match ready. The time you need depends on what you did in the off-season. So a normal elite off-season would, the season will end in November, and they'll have 4 to 6 weeks, and then they can start a pre-season gradually and be in contact by mid to late January. The problem here is we've had a bigger off-season, but they've also been able to, you would hope, keep some degree of conditioning going, which might accelerate it. I know that when they first floated the idea of coming out of lockdown, they went to the coaches, the S&C guys especially, and said, how long do you need? And some of them said 4 to 6 weeks, some of them said 8 to 12 weeks. So there was pretty wide range on what the coaches themselves thought. There comes a point, of course, where if you start any later, then you'll never finish. I mean, your one season will just bleed into the next. So that cutoff must be by late September. If you can't play by late September, you should just as well not begin, I would think. I don't think that a biodome bubble idea works. The cost is enormous. I know that the PSL are sort of doing something like that. And, just you imagine you've got a football team with 16 players and 10 support staff. That's 26 people at R1,000 a night for a hotel. I mean, you're paying almost R250,000 every 2 weeks, and you're doing that across 20 odd teams. So it's going to cost millions and millions to do that. And I don't think it's worth it. So I think they'll try and hope that the situation in South Africa continues to improve. I mean, our case numbers and so on are declining. Now that we're in level 2, they may trend back up. We'll see. But they'll try and do it in a normal way, perhaps, and hope that they can get some games going. The key thing for all sports is you just don't want sport to be the reason that there's been an outbreak. And that hasn't happened anywhere in the world. Even in the USA, where baseball and football training has begun. It didn't happen so far in England. They've been back for a few weeks in training. So I think the picture looks quite safe for us to start. But, we said in March that it might be a few months, and here we are in almost September. So guessing or making predictions at this stage only makes one look foolish.
And then just before we actually go to some questions for you, tell us a little bit about your podcast, your Real Science of Sport podcast. What have you guys been talking about? What are the new topics? What can we look forward to from the new ones that are coming out?
So I started a podcast because, as you may tell, I've got a lot to say, and I like talking about sports. So my mate, Mike Finch, who's an editor used to be Media 24, he does Runner's World and cycling, said to me, let's do this. And so we started this podcast last year called The Science of Sport. And the idea was that we would mix up 50% of our shows would be current affairs. So Caster Semenya's court case about should she compete or not. This transgender in sport thing will be a big one when I eventually can speak more about it. The world records that were broken, just like I was talking to Mbolela earlier about the shoes, should they be legal, should they not, doping scandals, all that kind of stuff. And then the other 50% is educational. So we talk about how do you train better to become a better athlete? What do you need to do to improve endurance as opposed to strength and power? So it's called The Science of Sport, and the idea is that we strip back and peel away the complexities about sports science and try and show people, the tagline was initially going to be sport through X-ray glasses. We're going to show you a hidden side of sports and give you insights that you wouldn't get anywhere else. So what are we doing next? We've got a supplement episode coming out soon. We're going to take a few big swings at supplement companies and their dishonesty. That should come out this week. And then we've got a few other experts lined up we want to talk to about training and strength work, muscle gain, that sort of stuff. We make it up as we go. So we'll see.
Okay, so Dave, do you have some questions for us? Okay. Big fan of the podcast, especially for your talks on DSDs. Could we send in some questions for the Q&A section of this episode? Well, please.
That's your question.
Yeah. What happened to Apiwe Deyanti? He does not seem to think that he was doping. His career is ruined now.
Yes. So that trial is due soon, actually. He should be having his hearing soon. There was a hold-up because his case is basically it required that a whole bunch of laboratory tests and so on needed to be repeated. Those have now been repeated, and I actually can't say too much more because 2 weeks ago his lawyer phoned me and they were looking for some inputs on certain elements of his defense. So he goes to that hearing with the South African Drug-Free Sport within the next 4 weeks with his arguments. Whether or not his career is ruined depends on the outcome of that. His case may be winnable, it may not. Anyway, I hate talking politics when I can't answer a question, so I'm just going to say I actually can't speak about it because I might be involved in that hearing in a few weeks' time, so I can't give away too much here. But it's still open, is the short answer, and it'll be closed sometime in September.
Okay, then, well, I hope we'll definitely have to get you back in a few weeks and so you can talk about it. Sport, Treshka van Asweken says, sport was so much easier in the past. A woman is a woman. and a man is a man, no matter what gender you want to identify with.
Yeah, look, I agree. I think the separation of athletes, humans, into a category of male, men, and female, women, exists for biological reasons, not social reasons. I mean, there's no rationale for why someone's self-identification should have a bearing on their sports performance. And so my personal feeling is that you must defend that line. I do understand that society wants to be tolerant of people's choices, and there's a point at which sport needs to reflect society. You can't sort of isolate and ring fence sport and say we're going to be bigoted. But in this instance, I don't think it is bigoted. I don't think it's discriminatory. I think that women, biological females, need to be protected. They need a category of their own because it's not fair otherwise. And so for me, this is a pretty straightforward issue. But I understand there are some people who see that differently. I just don't think that should change the outcome.
Dave, what do you have next for us? Ntokozo Majosi says that doping in boxing point is quite an interesting one. On roids, you really could kill a person. However, in a world in which everyone is doping behind closed doors, not doping could be fatal.
That's really interesting. I don't know if you guys have seen Beautiful Mind. I'm sure you have. But the guy played by Russell Crowe is a guy called John Forbes Nash, who wins a Nobel Prize for theories in economics, which basically revolve around this economic theory of game theory. And one of the applications of game theory is this thing called the prisoner's dilemma. I'm not going to bore you with details. But basically, the prisoner's dilemma is that if you don't know what someone else is doing and you have to make a decision for yourself about what you're going to do, with the right combination of incentives, there is a scenario where you would always do the dishonest thing. And doping is actually one of those, because just as the question alludes to, if everyone else is doping and you don't, you're going to be the sucker. In theory, you could be killed in this instance. If nobody else is doping and you don't, then you're equal. But if you do, then you're going to dominate. So no matter what everyone else does, your best approach is always to dope. And so someone once did this thing on doping and the prisoner's dilemma, and he made the point that unless you can make the disincentive and the punishment so large, the situation in sport right now is that no matter what everyone else does, whether they're all doping, like the question asks, or whether none of them are doping, your best bet would always be to dope. And that's what fundamentally needs to change, is they have to shift the incentives that your best thing is to not dope. Until they do that, of course they're going to dope. Like, why would you be the only clean guy in a room? You'd be the idiot. And I'm not endorsing doping, by the way.
So, but just before we go to this next question, Dave, taking this through to rugby, Ross, especially, I actually sent you a photo of a player the other day. What do you think happened in lockdown now? Do you think a lot more players did dope? Do you think, how are we going to handle this whole situation by doping in rugby? Because the guys are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which means the injuries will probably get more, because if you don't do it and you get tackled by a guy that looks like that, your chances of getting injured so much more.
Yeah, I mean, sport is musical chairs. Everyone knows that game. The music plays, we run around, the music stops, you grab a seat. And there's always going to be one guy who can't sit, and he's gone. That's how sport is. So a 17-year-old kid is looking for a professional contract with the Bulls. He's thinking, like, how do I maximize my chances for this? I know I'm not being tested because my school doesn't let them test me. And they don't care anyway, because they just want to win provincial tournaments and beat Affis or whatever it is. And so he's got every incentive to dope. And then once he becomes an adult, he's got every incentive to continue that. Maybe it changes slightly because he's being tested and so on, but whatever. So the problem is, in lockdown, anti-doping basically stopped in many countries in the world. Like, I think I heard the other day that in the USA, they managed to do about 25% of their normal testing. I could be wrong on the number. I'm a bit hazy. But some countries did none. They couldn't, because it was deemed unsafe to go to people's houses and get a blood sample and a urine sample. So in the complete absence of doping control and testing, what do you think athletes were going to do? Obviously, some of them are going to cheat. Like, the only thing you're relying on now is honesty, and that's not going to work. So I have some doubts over what would have happened during lockdown. Hopefully the effect is minimal and they weren't going nuts about it. But I don't know. There just need to be checks and balances to try and change the size of rugby players. And it's not unique to rugby, but it certainly is a problem. And the sport's well aware of it, by the way. Like Eddie Jones has spoken up and said, Warren Gatlin said, it's like watching 50 car accidents a match, you know. So like everyone knows that something needs to be done there. And they're looking at incidentally, we're looking at substitutes as a way to potentially change this, because you know, you've got 8 guys on the bench, and you can prepare those 8 players to play 30 minutes, 20 minutes. And I mean, if you're being prepared for a 20-minute effort compared to an 80-minute effort, think about the difference in your training. So it's possible they can depower the sport with the substitution change. That's being investigated at the moment.
Dave, what do you have for me next? Woude, as a female athlete, how would you feel about competing against transgender women / men? The rig. So, I mean, me personally, I would feel like it's very unfair. Working as hard as I am, I can only get to a certain level. And Ross and I have actually had these conversations before, because I just feel like it's not fair. I understand from that point of view. I understand that it is also a difficult situation in this whole world that we're in at the moment. But for me personally, I just wouldn't think it's fair.
So can I say something on that? The thing about that is, if you are an exceptional female athlete, you wouldn't mind, because the person coming in might be less athletic than you are, even though they're biologically male. And so your exceptional athleticism and their biological maleness might cancel out. And then you'd actually be pretty stoked with yourself, because you're playing against biological male and you're doing okay. But the moment that biological male's better than you, now you've got every ground in the world to argue. And that's why the issue gets so difficult, because some people ask athletes whether they mind, and they say, no, I've got no problem, because they've never experienced what it's like to actually have their place taken away, or to lose, or to be beaten by that individual. So until that starts happening more often, I don't think athletes will be honest about this. They're too scared to speak up because of the backlash. You look at J.K. Rowling the other day, made a comment about it, and she's had hate mail ever since. Like, women athletes are scared to talk about this one.
Dave, do you have any more questions for us, or for us? The rig says, what about someone like Caster Semenya? Is that tougher to work around than transgender issues? And I'm going to throw this on to Ross, because he knows way more than me about this.
So, what a question. Good one, eh? Good question. Caster Semenya is more difficult, because what's happening there is you've got an athlete who has a very rare condition. There's a few different types which interfere or affect the normal development of sex. So normally the pathway from our chromosomes to our reproductive system to our biological sex is pretty straight. It's a clean line. But in literally 1 in 2,000 people or something like that, it doesn't quite work. And then what you get is an individual who is identified at birth as a girl. She is raised by her family as a girl. Her community believes that she's a girl, a female. And so she begins to compete in sport as a girl, and then sport tells her that she's wrong. And that's the problem. It's an ethical issue. Biologically, the same issues are often in play, because the person has got elevated levels of testosterone, which they often can use. Sometimes not, sometimes they can. That's where it gets even more murky. But let's assume that they can use testosterone. They develop male physiology. So from a physiology perspective, Semenya and transgender women is relatively similar in principle, but it's an ethical and a medical issue, because now sport is actually not listening to someone say, I'm male, I'm female, I'm a man, I'm a woman. They're actually telling someone, you're not a woman, you're a man, and you have to compete against men. So for me, the level of evidence that you needs to be considerably higher if you're going to tell someone they're wrong. And that's the difference, is that Semenya is being told that her gender is X as opposed to Y, whereas transgender athletes are telling you, and that's the fundamental difference. But it is so complicated, that issue, because it invites a whole world of ethics that transgender just doesn't, and that in itself is complicated. So, yeah, tough question.
Dave, what's up next? The Rick says, Roz, what about transgender man? Would they be allowed to take testosterone and compete against men?
The Rig has been studying up. The Rig knows this stuff. Who are you? You're not guessing here. Yes, they can. So a transgender man, remember, is a person who's born and is biologically female and then reassigns to live as a man. That person is allowed to take testosterone to facilitate their transition to being a man. And sport generally doesn't mind that person competes against men, because the effects of taking testosterone as a medical product don't overcome the benefit that males get from having testosterone naturally. So until someone is able to show me that someone taking testosterone can take so much of it that they actually become supermen, I would have no theoretical objection with that, and neither does sport. So most sports would allow it to happen, provided they're not obviously doping with so much testosterone they're glowing in the dark. But that, you see, that doesn't happen because it's just so unsafe. They'd kill themselves doing it. Where it is a problem, and this is quite interesting, is that some states in the USA, and I can't speak for the rest of the world, they don't allow you to compete outside the category of your birth. And so there is a high school wrestler who was born female, has reassigned as a transgender man, and is now taking testosterone, who is forced to fight against girls. Now that's doping. So that's a girl who's taking excessive testosterone to become a boy, man, not biologically, but transgender man, but is actually being asked to fight against girls even while taking testosterone. And that's just silly. You shouldn't. I mean, that's a doping offense. I'm not blaming the individual, but the policy creates a doper. It's stupid.
Anything else for us? JD Conradi says, Science of Sport, I would say this evidence is more powerful than all the words and papers. I am a scientist by training, but I've also played rugby since a 7-year-old boy and can't see why this is even up for discussion. The under-16 team at top rugby schools will demolish a ladies-only team.
They would. I can't disagree. I mean, like I said, the top 100-meter woman in history is beaten every year by literally hundreds of 15-year-olds. The world under-14 record is faster than the women's record for boys. And the differences in the upper body are even larger than the differences in the lower body. So 99% of boys throw balls further than the elite women do. In weightlifting, for instance, the under-19 world records for boys are higher or heavier than the elite women's world records. So there's no doubt. I mean, you can look it up online. It was a few years ago, the USA women's national football team, which is the iconic women's football team, played against a junior team in Texas, not even one of the best ones, and they were hammered 5-2, I think the scoreline was. And you know this, every parent listening to this, you know, your kids can play together up to the age of 10, 11, 12, and then the miracle or the curse of puberty hits kids, and all of a sudden males go this way and women go on a much slower trajectory, and by the time they're 15, 16, it's like two different human beings. So it's pretty clear to me that those differences are large. And what sport has to grapple with is, can you, quote unquote, fix it? So in other words, the policy in sport has always been, if I'm biologically male, well, I am biologically male, I can lower my testosterone levels through medication, the removal of testes. Does that take the advantages away? And for many years, sport has felt that it does. And they've allowed athletes to compete, male athletes to compete in women's sport with lower testosterone. All the evidence we've looked at suggests that it doesn't, and that's the reason for the recommendation that was made. So I agree, it's obvious and intuitive. Sport is trying to be inclusive, as I mentioned. Inclusive, fair, safe. They've tried to balance them. I just don't see that it's possible, unfortunately.
Okay, JD Conradi again. Sorry, I'm a bit late to this. Have you spoken about the New Zealand powerlifter that dominated the meet? If this will be allowed all over sport, will there still be female sport?
Yeah, so the person JD's talking about there is called Lauren Hubbard. She won the Commonwealth Games. In fact, there's a video on YouTube. It's pretty gruesome. She actually was attempting a Commonwealth record and then dislocated an elbow, I think was the injury. She then went on to win a Pacific Games. She was potentially an outside shot at a medal at the Olympic Games. She is a transgender woman, was a relatively decent but not exceptional male weightlifter, and then transitioned, and now at the age of 40-something, which is way, way, way older than elite weightlifters, she's one of the best in the world. And she's one of the cases that I think shows that the advantage is retained. So she is, had the Tokyo Olympics gone ahead this year, she would have been one of the big storylines there, because she might have become, it's an outside shot, but she might have been the first transgender medalist. And there's a very famous picture on the internet where the two athletes she beats are two Samoan weightlifters, and they refuse to look up during the anthem in protest. So that's the kind of thing that's happening. It's a silent protest by these two Samoans. Look it up on Google, you'll find it. Will it be the end of women's sports? No. In terms of integrity and principle, yes. But at the moment, transgender women, there's so few of them that it's not like you're just going to get this absolute tidal wave coming through. So people who say, every medal in the next 5 years will be won by men in women's sport, that's not going to happen. There just aren't enough of them. But I don't want to play that game where you say, well, 10 is okay, but 20 is not. For me, as a principle, you defend the line, irrespective of whether it's 1 or 1,000. So.
Future of Britain blog, Science of Sport, Fair and at Fair Play Women. Can we assume that you have shared your research with World Rugby and Bruin Jr.?
Yeah. The meeting was held in February, and I'm part of the working group within World Rugby that then eventually worked on the draft guidelines. We put together a working group that had legal, medical, scientific, women's rugby players, women's rugby management, independent external people. There was a psychiatrist on that committee. And so, we heard all that evidence, we gathered, we assimilated it, we produced the document, which, as I said, has now gone out to consultation. It was leaked so people can read more or less what it said, and I'm not going into the specifics of it here, but I've been involved in that process and the discussions around it, and I can't stress enough, we're trying really hard to listen to all the perspectives, because they do matter. People's opinions do matter. I'm quite clear. I'm a physiologist and a biologist, so I know exactly where I stand on the issue. But I appreciate that there are ethical and social and legal matters that I'm not qualified to necessarily comment on. And that's why we put together a group of people who had those experts and came up with the guidelines. So, but short answer is yes, they know.
Okay, we've got one more from Trishka from Asweg. Should coaches not try harder to stop doping, or are they part of the problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Part of the solution is to nail the coaches when the athletes get done, because then you can start penalizing the entourage instead of just the athletes. Again, it brings you back to the same problem as you find with the lifetime ban, because if you're going to ban a coach and an athlete and a medical doctor and a masseuse, and you're going to you could ruin 4 people's lives by accident. So you've got to be really sure about it. But the short answer is that a lot of the time, the coach must be facilitating the process of doping. It's often very difficult, especially young athletes who are not always the most educated in the world, and they get roped into take this, it's a vitamin. Next week, take this, it's a drink you need, and 3 weeks later, it's an injection. That's coming from the entourage, not necessarily the coach, but certainly the entourage. And if you are truly serious about cutting out doping, you need the entire system to be punished. You need the athlete to actually testify against the coach, because the coach might be the supplier. It's not different to, like, I don't know. Okay, my perspectives on this are Hollywood led, but like if I'm watching detective type stuff in the States on TV, you don't just get the user. You actually try and break the drug ring. You want to find out who's making the drug, who's supplying it, who's selling it, who's distributing it. That's kind of the approach that you would want to take in sports as well. And then I think you'll find that often it is the coach who's the problem, and you can go after that coach and try and clean doping up that way. WADA, by the way, have now got an allowance to go after the entourage, but I don't think it's used often enough. If I look at the number of Kenyan athletes in the last 5 or 6 years who've doped, and they all come from the same squad. They've all got the same agents and the same coaches, but no one ever does anything about them. That can't be left alone like that, in my opinion. So I agree with you. They're part of the problem, and they should be punished for it when it's provable.
I must say, I already feel a lot smarter after this. Thanks, Russ. Mbolelo, back to you.
Good stuff there, huh? Ross Tucker, Ph.D. I need to work on that. I need to get that Ph.D. thing going. Taking about 20 years. Awesome stuff. I mean, that's the type of stuff we want to bring you. You know, the Science of Sport podcast, if you haven't listened to it, go and give it a listen. Because, to be honest, we're not involved, but I love it. We want to bring you the best information. This is literally the best information in the world. This is a man who has worked his tail off. You know, we get obsessed sometimes with, this person's so smart. He has worked his tail off to be where he is. He represents South Africa around the world. So it's incredibly important for us to support people like Ross because, number one, he's South African, right? And some people aren't patriotic, but, you know, I love where I'm from, and Ross puts us on the world map, and Professor Tucker puts us on the world map, and I'm extremely proud and honored to have him on the show. And it's really for CliffCentral and for all of us, this is the best information in the world coming from somebody who's really involved at the top. So it's an honor to have had Ross here, and it's not going to get any better than what you've just heard. If you have questions, by the way, go and listen to the pod. Go and follow Ross Sports or the Science of Sport podcast. I mean, available everywhere. We do have the link in the description. Ross, when he does more episodes, he'll send us those links, or I'll post the links up. But in the description of the video, and we'll have it in the description of the podcast as well, the great Professor Ross Tucker, ladies and gentlemen. But for today, you know, that's one South African making us proud, and it's not cynical, right? We get real about it, because when you get real about issues, you solve issues. Anybody in life that wants to let things sit in the dark and, oh my God, it'll work out, don't run from issues, because they become monsters. That's what happens. What Ross is saying is, don't be cynical, right? Be honest. When you're honest, you acknowledge. From acknowledging, you're able to solve. And it's the way good science works, and it's the way brilliant people work. And you've just heard from the best in the business. Once again, an absolute honor. Speaking of another South African making us proud, he's in Belgium at the moment. Tomorrow, from a goalkeeper, Darren Keat. Cannot wait, because he's full of beans. Cannot wait to have Darren Keat on tomorrow. But for today, ladies and gentlemen, it has been wonderful. You could have been anywhere tonight. I hope you're safe. I hope you're loved, and you chose to be with us. And the great Professor Ross Tucker and the lovely Woude Muller, of course, they were brilliant. Go and check out the Science Sports podcast. Cannot wait to listen to the latest episode, and much, much more. Cannot wait to have Ross back. But for tonight, ladies and gentlemen, it has been an honor and a pleasure to be with you. It has also been a different ball game.